The palace lights shimmered against the dark horizon, each one reflecting the illusion of perfection that the world loved to see. But beneath that radiance stood a man who carried storms within his chest. Sheikh Hamdan, the prince the world adored, the poet they called Fazza. He smiled for the cameras, waved for the crowds, and spoke like a king born of grace. Yet behind every polished word was a heart aching beneath the weight of expectation. Not every crown hides gold, some hide pain so heavy that even the stars dare not touch it. They saw him as untouchable, the face of strength, the embodiment of calm. But they never saw the nights when silence became his only companion. Behind the walls of gold and marble, he battled shadows no one could name. His laughter was rehearsed, his composure royal, but his poetry was the only truth left in him. In those verses, he stripped the crown away, bleeding ink instead of tears, confessing to the page what he could never say to the world. He had learned early that royalty was a language of sacrifice. Every smile was diplomacy, every word a performance. The crown didn't sit on his head, it rested on his soul, pressing down with unseen weight. People thought the crown symbolized glory, but he knew it also hid grief. Beneath its golden shine were sleepless nights and whispered prayers for peace. It was not gold that gleamed, it was endurance, it was pain polished into duty. He used to wonder if anyone truly saw him, the man behind the title, the heart behind the heritage. For every poem he wrote about love and hope, there was another he never shared, one about loneliness, about duty stealing the warmth from his youth. He had learned to smile through sorrow, to speak strength when silence would have been truer. His heart had learned to bow long before his body did. And though the world crowned him, they never noticed the invisible cracks beneath the shine. There were moments when he envied the common hearts, those who could love freely, cry openly, live without eyes watching their every breath. He had been born into admiration, yet starved for understanding. What good was gold when it could not hold him when he fell? What was a throne worth if it could not feel the ache of his pulse? He had everything the world desired, yet he often stood before the mirror asking himself, who am I when the crown comes off? The truth was, he was a poet long before he was a prince. The rhythm of his heart beat louder than the sound of his title. His poems were his rebellion, his quiet war against the perfection the world demanded. Each line he wrote was a whisper of freedom, a way to remind himself that beneath the royal robes lived a man who still felt deeply, who still dreamed of simplicity. His crown might have sparkled in daylight, but his soul only glowed in the dark. Sometimes he would escape the palace at dawn, riding into the open desert where no cameras followed. There, the wind didn't care about his bloodline. The sand didn't ask about his title. The falcons didn't bow, they simply soared. In that freedom, he found fragments of himself that he had lost to duty. The desert, silent and vast, became his confession booth. He spoke not in words but in sighs, and the dunes listened, like an old friend who finally understood. He often thought about how people misunderstood royalty. They saw power, not pressure. They saw elegance, not exhaustion. They wanted perfection, not humanity. Yet the truth of every crown was this: it was not made to glorify, but to test. Some crowns are gold, yes. But others are forged from the fire of unseen struggles. And his was made of both. Each jewel on it represented a promise he could never break, a dream he had to bury. There were times he longed to remove it entirely, to walk barefoot into the streets as no one, as nothing but a man, to be held not for his name, but for his soul. To love without consequence, to weep without judgment. But even his tears had to be hidden behind palace walls. The world did not want a broken prince, they wanted a legend. So he wore his pain with grace, turning every wound into poetry, every ache into silence that roared louder than thunder. And yet, beneath that weight, there was beauty. Because pain had made him gentle. Loss had made him wise. He had learned that power means little without compassion, and love means more when it cannot be owned. He found me.
There were evenings when the weight of silence inside the palace felt heavier than the crown itself. The walls, adorned with gold and glory, seemed to echo with unspoken sorrows. He would sit by the window, watching the city glitter below, every light a reminder of how alone a king could feel among millions. The world called him blessed, but blessings too can bleed. Behind the shimmer of royalty, there was a man who carried memories instead of medals, heartbreak instead of pride. Sometimes he wondered if his crown had cost him more than it had ever given. It had taken away his right to cry openly, to falter, to be weak. Every time he wanted to scream, he smiled instead. Every time he wanted to grieve, he wrote. The crown demanded perfection, but his heart longed for permission to simply exist as himself, without the burden of expectations that followed his every breath. He learned to replace vulnerability with poise, but deep inside, the poet still wept for the boy who once dreamed freely. The poets who came before him wrote of kings and empires, Fazza wrote of humanity. He wrote not to impress, but to survive. His verses were carved from nights of unrest, each line a mirror reflecting his truth. And though the people adored his words, they never realized how much of himself he left between them. Poetry became his quiet rebellion, a way to bleed gracefully, to turn sorrow into art before it consumed him whole. Every stanza was a confession he could not speak aloud. When the world slept, he would walk through the empty courtyards, his footsteps echoing against marble that had seen generations of kings. In the quiet, he would look up at the sky and whisper prayers that had no beginning or end. He no longer asked for strength, he already had too much of it. What he sought was peace, the kind that comes when a man is finally free from the masks he wears. But the stars, in their silent mercy, only watched him, reflecting the same pain back at him. There was a gentleness in him that the crown could never crush. He carried compassion like a second skin,